Okay, welcome everyone to our Delta Think News and Views discussion webinar series. For those of you who've joined us before, welcome back. We've been doing this for several years now, so we're excited to see you again. And for those of you who are new, we're glad that you decided to join us today. First, let me start off with a few introductions. I'm Lori Carlin, Chief Commercial Officer here at Delta Think, and I'll be moderating the session for today. With me are my colleagues, Heather Staines, Strategy Consultant here at Delta Think and Director of Community Engagement for our Data and Analytics tool, and Dan Pollock, our Chief Digital Officer, and along with Ann Michael, an architect of our Data and Analytics tool. If you've joined us for a News and Views discussion in the past, then you know we've designed these to be interactive, and we hope you have lots of questions. And we're looking forward to you all participating. A few logistical items before we begin. When you have a question, if you can use the Q&A box, that would be really helpful. In terms of structure, we'll have some opening remarks from Dan and Heather to start us off, and then we'll move into the questions and open discussion after that. And we will certainly end before 11, but the session will go as long as we have items to discuss up until that 1 hour mark. So thank you for joining us, and I'll hand off to Heather now to get us started.
Thanks, Lori. This webinar is always a highlight of the year for me, so we're happy to be here. We'll follow like a similar overview outline to what we've done in the past. Dan's going to kick us off with some of the headlines, and if you took a look at the news and views last week, you will have already had some time to think about these. The news and views is available via the Delta Think website, and maybe Lori can drop the link into the chat for us as well. So Dan's going to be throwing out some numbers and things. Those all come from the news and views, and we have a couple of visuals to help you as well. Our usual caveats that we look at the trends in APC pricing, but your average prices will, of course, vary. They'll vary for researchers depending upon where their activity takes place. Publisher size is going to be, a factor in looking at this as well, and the spread of prices. So we'll be talking about all of those things, but I'm going to hand over to Dan now, and he's going to cover the methodology that we use every year to put this together and give us the headlines.
Thanks, Heather. Hello, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. So yes, every year we round up a list of article processing charges, aka APCs. So these are the individual per paper charges that publishers will levy to publish articles open access. Open access we define to mean free of charge for the reader to access and largely free of restrictions for the reader to reuse. So it's following the classic Budapest Open Access BOA. I can't remember Budapest Open Access Declaration. Is it the BOAD? I can't remember. Back from a few years ago. We gather around about 15 to 16,000 prices every year from the top 30 or so major publishers. We define a major publisher to be either a very big publisher, so that could be a very large corporate or a significant size society. And then we also include what we might term some more newsworthy publishers in the open access space. So some of those smaller publishers that may only have a few journals or may only publish a relatively small volume of papers, but nonetheless who you might expect to see in a sample that covers open access. When we gather the list, we try and take a snapshot of price lists at the same time every year. Last week in January, it then takes us 2 or 3 weeks or so to actually crunch those numbers and produce the results that I'm about to present to you. The reason we do that is because an individual publisher may in actual fact set their prices at different times of the year, depending on the publisher. Many of them might set their prices, for example, towards the end of the year, looking towards the year to come. Some put prices up in the summer and so on. So by our taking a consistent snapshot at the same time every year, we can then compare like for like annual trends to see how the prices might be changing over time, and we'll speak to some of that as well. Over the years, we've been doing this, I think it's about the 8th year we've been running this now at scale. Just to give you a sense of what our sample covers, we think the total output of papers in all of the journals for which we gather prices accounts for around about 40 to 45% of the core scholarly output. So it's a pretty significant sample. We think is very reflective of the marketplace. In other words, the area in which money is likely to change hands. We do, of course, have to acknowledge there is a long tail of small, quite often community-run journals that may be run, for example, directly out of a university department or by volunteer specialists. It's highly unlikely they are going to figure in directly to economic calculations if you are a funder or a grant winner or so on. So we do not include that long tail in our sample. We're focusing, as I said, on the marketplace. Over those 8 years or so, of course, new journals are launched and some are closed down. So we think our total data set covers around about 18 to 20,000 individual titles. As I said, around about 15 or 16,000 in any given year. So a pretty comprehensive roundup. Finally, we, for the sake of consistency, will round up list prices for the most permissive, so typically a CC BY license. So you can compare like for like. We find publishers, of course, may change their prices depending on which license you go for. So particularly in the medical space, for example, publishers may charge more for a CC BY license publication compared with, say, a CC BY NC ND. So that's something with non-commercial and non-derivative restrictions on it. But also publishers may change their prices depending on the nature of the article. So we are looking at peer-reviewed research articles or review articles, other things such, for example, as a conference abstract or a short form piece may track lower APCs. So we're very much looking at peer-reviewed content, CCBY, list prices before any discounts, so we can then get a true like-for-like comparison between different publishers. And finally, our sample includes the whole of the publishers' currently available journals or journals that are currently accepting submissions. So we also gather information on journals that do not charge, that do not have an open access option, that may not charge APCs for various reasons, even though they do have an open access option. And we're bringing in both fully open, aka gold, and also hybrid journals. And of course, for hybrid journals, we're looking at the APCs for the open access component. And the reason we do that is because some of our analysis may get into what share of the market has open access facilities or what share of the market is subscription access only. So of course, to do that, we need to gather information across all journal types, although here we are presenting largely the subset of that data focusing on open access. So that's the methodology in, I hope, eye-watering levels of depth, and I hope that will anticipate various questions that you have. But as Laurie said, please do fire any questions to us via the Q&A, and we'll do our best to pick them up. So having gathered all of this data, crunched all the numbers, what are the headlines? Well, going into 2025, we see that APCs continue to increase, but that price increase has fallen back to long-term trends. So what that means is this time last year, in 2024, we found that the APCs had increased by a significant amount. Heather, you don't need to change the slide just yet. What we found was this time last year, APCs had increased by about 9.5% over the year before. This year, that average price increase was 6.5% over the year before, and that's for fully open journals. Hybrid journals, the average APC this year had increased by about 3%. This time last year, that increase was 4.2%. So you can see that last year we'd seen, I think, some unusually high price increases. This year, they're falling back to the kind of averages that we've seen over the long term. You will notice that fully open access prices have increased by a larger percentage than their hybrid equivalents. But it's worth noting that fully open access on average tends to be cheaper. So higher price increases from a slightly lower base. And then just to give you a few other headline statistics, the maximum APC charged for a fully open journal has remained constant at $8,900, whereas the maximum APC charged for a hybrid journal, that's now up to $12,690. That's up $400 from the maximum this time last year. Both of those sort of high headline numbers, they're coming from large publishers with the very, very high impact, sort of big brand journals. And we saw back in, I think, 2020, 2021, that kind of time, that was a time when these big high impact journals first started introducing open access options, and they levied charges commensurate with their perceived position in the marketplace. And when those big high impact journals first introduced these very high APCs, that had an effect of uplifting average prices in the overall market. The other time we've seen a big spike in price increases in the overall market, as I said, was last year. And I think that was coming off the back of a year of above average inflation. So there's been kind of two spikes in price increases over the last 5 years or so. Just a few other trends before I sort of throw things back to Heather. What we found is there are way more journals, hybrid open access journals, than there are fully open access ones. So it's roughly 2.6 times or 2.6x more hybrid journals than fully open access ones. But that 2.6 has dropped slightly. It was 2.9 times this time last year. So we're seeing, we think what's happened is actually the number of fully open access journals has increased, whereas the number of hybrid journals available has remained largely constant. On average, I think I mentioned this earlier, fully open access prices are cheaper than those of a hybrid, roughly 64%. So average fully open access APC is roughly 64% of the average hybrid APC. And that's just a couple of percentage points higher than longer term trends. So fully open access pricing is catching up hybrid pricing, but well, only slowly. And then finally, looking at our fully open access journals only, we reckon that just under 1/3, about 31%, do not levy any APCs at all. So they make their content available and their publishing available free of charge. And typically this would be because they are some sort of sponsored journal, aka diamond or platinum, etc., depending on your nuances on methodology. Or that could be because they're introducing some sort of introductory short-term fee waiver. I think that's about it for the headlines. Heather, I'm going to throw this back to you in case you want to just come in there at all, or we can push on with price distribution.
I think let's go on with price distribution, and I'll go to the first slide.
Okay, so I've come out with some headlines, this sort of average price increase and average prices. The interesting thing, of course, is that once you break the averages down, you see all sorts of interesting patterns happening within those. And that's what this next couple of charts aims to explore. So this first chart that Heather's thrown up is looking at the distribution of prices for hybrid journals. What are typical hybrid APCs? Now, if you're a subscriber to our tool, you will get the labeled axes with all the numbers, etc. We have to keep something in reserve. So for public consumption, we're simply presenting the shapes of the charts. But I think the basic principles you will find still apply. So what we are seeing here is on the horizontal x-axis, we're plotting how much does the journal charge, and we split our prices into $500 bands, basically. So we're looking at price band at the bottom. On the left-hand side is very, very cheap, less than $500. On the right-hand side, we're going up to sort of above $6,000 or so. And then vertically, we're plotting the number of journals that are charging that price. So what we're looking at here is how popular are different price bands. The eagle-eyed amongst you will have noticed, of course, there are several lines on the chart, color-coded differently. And what we've done here is each line represents a different year's prices. So as you work from the darker green lines through to the lighter orange than red lines, what we're trying to do here is get a sense of what are the most popular price bands and how are they changing over time from a few years back till the present day. And what we found is, if you look at the peak on the chart, that's the most popular price band. And I think a few years ago, 2016, 2017, that left-hand peak was showing that there was a very, very popular price band back there. But over the intervening time, that most popular price band has moved to the right. In other words, it's become more expensive. So what we've found is, I think that publishers as a whole have decided they're going to charge slightly more for hybrid open access APCs. And that's become a very, very commonplace thing, hence the spike in the chart. However, the other interesting thing is, as you move from the right-hand peak a few years ago to the most recent prices, you'll see the peak starts to flatten out and the curve gets wider at the bottom. And what that's telling us is that as time has gone on, although the most popular price band has remained the same, increasing numbers of journals are charging more prices than the popular price band. So in other words, publishers are slowly putting up prices, and they're slowly moving their prices to be slightly more and more than average. And what that means is the shape of the curve then flattens out and fattens out. So you've got the total same number of journals under the curve, but you're just finding more and more of them are charging slightly higher prices. And that's indicated by arrow number 3 on the chart, the right-hand one. The left-hand dotted line labeled number 3, that's indicating that in actual fact, the cheaper side of the popular price band is kind of getting less common. So the left-hand side of the chart is steepening. And again, I think that's an indication that publishers are pushing their prices slightly more towards the expensive end of the spectrum. The point about all this is how you optimize your prices if you are a seller in this market. Of course, the more stuff you charge, or the higher the price you charge, and the more stuff that gets published at that price, then of course, the more revenue you will bring in if you're offering services. But of course, if you are buying services, then that means things get slightly more expensive for you. So this is what we're seeing. We're actually seeing a form of really inflation in the way prices are set. We feel this is an important analysis because it breaks apart those headline averages and really makes the point that if we say, gee, the average price has gone up by X or Y%, you actually need to pull apart the data a little bit more to figure out what that might mean for you. So this is hybrid APCs. Heather, if you please advance the slide, we can then have a look at what's going on for fully open, aka gold APCs. We prefer the term fully open access to the term gold, simply because we feel fully open access better describes what the journal does. But I do acknowledge that gold is the historical term that was coined certainly a decade and a half or so ago to describe fully open journals. We tend to steer away from colors because nobody can quite agree what they mean. And gold, for example, can mean to some people that you simply charge for an APC, and that might be a charged APC in a hybrid journal. Others would argue gold means a fully open journal only. So we're going to call it fully open access. And this chart is showing what's going on with the popular price bands for fully OA. Similar layout, price bands horizontally, numbers of titles in each vertically, one line per year of data going from green, old to red or new. The horizontal axis is the same scale as the previous slide. So the fact the whole chart has moved to the left is telling us that fully open APCs are on the whole cheaper than hybrid ones, but you'll see the shape of the chart is more complicated. So we seem to have almost 2 peaks in the chart. In other words, 2 very popular price bands, one very cheap and one kind of, I guess middle to expensive. And that's changed over time as indicated by the wiggly arrow, the wiggly dotted line. But what we have found is that the peak of the chart has increased and moved to the right. So that is telling us that the more popular brand over time has become more expensive. Sorry, the more popular price band over time has become more expensive. And because the area under the chart has increased, the peak's gone up, and you'll see it's getting fatter to the right. That tells us there's more and more journals becoming available in our sample size. So in other words, the number of fully open access journals has increased over time. And then you'll notice really over time, again, as with the hybrid journals, the right-hand side of the chart has become fatter and fatter, suggesting that increasing proportions of journals are charging slightly higher than average or slightly higher than the most popular prices. It so happens this year, the most recent year's data, we've got this weird plateau in the red line in the chart. We think that's really largely a coincidence. Remember, we're actually looking at price bands here. So the lines are artificially smooth. We do that so you can actually read the chart and see the changes in shape. But technically, each of those lines represents a series of thick bars, if you think of it like a bar chart. And I think really what's happened is just purely coincidentally, we've seen some price increases sort of in the middle of that x-axis. So price increases that are above the most popular price band, and coincidentally increases have pushed to sort of, if you like, the next price band up and the one beyond that. So we're seeing a slight flattening of the curve, which I think is more a statistical anomaly than any major kind of trend or shift in the marketplace. And I suspect we may find that the chart smooths out when we run this exercise this time next year. We have dived into the data. Yes, there's been a few movements. I mean, some individual publishers may, for example, have flipped a number of journals from hybrid to fully open, but those tend to be numbered in the dozens or tens. They're not being numbered in the kind of hundreds or thousands. So there doesn't seem to be enough going on to suggest a particular trend. So as I said, I think that plateau is more statistical anomaly than some grand conspiracy or major trend in the marketplace. So pricing distribution is quite complicated, but as we said, what we like to do is break apart those headline averages and look at what are the most popular price bands and then how our prices spread either side of them. So you can get a sense of what's cheap, what's expensive, and where publishers are choosing to focus the sort of bias of their pricing so they can optimize the money that they're bringing in. And of course, as I said, depending on whether you're a buyer or a seller, that will have different implications for you as to whether it makes things more lucrative or more expensive.
Yeah, and if I could just add, to that, and that's great. That's a great coverage there, Dan. Publishers are getting a lot more sophisticated, with their pricing. They have a lot of data that they can go by. And while in the earliest, earlier days of open access, trying to see what the most popular price point could be a primary guiding factor. Now there's a lot of other, considerations, that come into play. And, if you are thinking about either adding an APC for a journal that didn't have one, or kind of right sizing your APC, whether that is up or down, and it could be a decision that you make either way. It's more than just knowing what most people are doing. It's what your peers are doing, and again, what those trends look like over time. So you know how that's going to come through, to the researchers on the other end, who are going to be paying those APCs.
Great, thank you both. We do have a question from our attendees to start off with. So have we looked at all at nonprofits separately and what those APCs might look like?
So yes, and if you go into our tool, you can actually split out. We split out society titles versus other titles, and we deem societies to be a reasonable proxy for non-profit. I know there'll be some other organizations that will not quite fit those definitions. So yes, we can split that out. We do see as to do we see an increase? It varies. It depends on the publisher. I don't have an exact percentage to hand. I'm sorry, I can't give you that top of mind. But yes, certainly some societies will put their prices up. Others will hold them the same. And that's pretty well the same as for commercial publishers or other titles. Price increases do vary per publisher. So as ever, that average, when we say there's an average increase of 6.5%, that's a very, very broad church. There will be a lot of variation within that. Very occasionally, you might even see price reductions, although they tend to be the exception rather than the rule. But certainly different publishers will put prices up to a different extent. Many of them will just hold their prices from one year to the next and then maybe pop them up every 2 or 3 years. depending, I suppose, on the pressures facing them. So I hope that covers off the.
And just one of the data points that Dan mentioned, we do track society journals who use commercial publishing partners. We will track them separately from their commercial partners. So that is data that you can get from the tools.
Great, thank you. So last year, the number of journals in the most popular hybrid price band were almost exactly the same as 2023, as the year before. And then this year, we see that number drop. What does that say about the pricing shift?
Yeah, so some of these things, Dan, has already covered in his remark. As the number of titles is not changing dramatically, on the hybrid side. Whereas we see, when most publishers are launching new journals now, not 100% the case, but likely those will be OA journals, and so we do see more movement in the numbers on the OA side compared to the hybrid. But that I think maybe folks were holding steady on their price increases a little bit in the whatever the post-COVID or still COVID or long COVID or whatever era that we're in now. And so that number, just shifting from people hovering around the most popular price point to, nudging them up a little bit, as they can. And these are our headlines around APCs, and then we'll drill into some other aspects of that in future news and views, throughout the year. So we may try to do some sample checks to see where these journals are moving. Are they moving by one price band? Or are they moving by more than one price band? And that may well vary by subject area and other factors as well. Oh, you're muted, Lori.
My space bar did not unmute me that time. Okay. Inflation. What's the impact there? Or what more do we want to say there?
Yeah, so inflation actually is quite an interesting thing to dive into. We'll probably do another one of our monthly analyses, our so-called news and views, in a month or two-ish. Exact publishing date yet to be agreed. So we'll do a bit of a deep dive into that. Inflation is quite interesting because if you look at things overall, in real terms, we actually think that prices have shrunk very slightly. So in other words, once you factor in, so inflation is basically running higher than the price increases. As a general rule, it will depend on whether you're looking at fully open journals or hybrid journals. So you'll see a slight difference in that. So we could argue that although prices are going up, they're not going up quite as quickly as inflation, and therefore in real terms, they're kind of holding steady or slightly less. Again, it will depend on the discipline you're in, and for a publisher that may have put their prices up higher than average, of course, then that will lead to real terms price increases. For one that's maybe showing much lower price increases or holding steady, of course, that then could become a real terms price cut. Depends on hybrid or fully open, depends on discipline or subject area. So yeah, we do track the effects of inflation, and then we also try and pick a sensible measure of inflation. One of the challenges with dealing with inflation in the publishing space is that our industry is global. So of course, although you may be, let's say, a US-based publisher, you will be getting submissions from around the world. And so which inflation measure do you take? Because the retail price index or consumer price index or whatever the inflation index is in the US may be different to that in Germany, to in the UK, to, I don't know, the EU as a whole, etc. So we will get into that in our inflation analysis as well. There's some nuances as to which measure you choose, but essentially we do try and take a global view on that. One other related thing to inflation is also currency effects. So what are exchange rates doing? We want to compare like for like. So of course, one of the things in our method, which I didn't mention, was we have to convert all prices to the same currency. We use the US dollar. as really that's the most prevalent currency in our sample. And a nuance there is when we're gathering prices, if the publisher offers a US dollar price list, we will use that. So you may have, for example, a British publisher that has prices listed in British pounds, US dollars, euros. We will take the US dollar slice of their list. So we'll let them do the exchange rate conversion because we want to reflect what publishers are saying. However, not every publisher offers that. So where we get a non-US price list, we will then convert that to US dollars at the average exchange rate for the year to which the prices apply. And we may find that as dollar price or foreign exchange rates change from one year to the next, that might, of course, affect the numbers that are coming in to our averages, and that might, if you like, have an inflationary or deflationary effect on prices. And of course, the publishers themselves, if a big publisher wants to quote prices in different currencies, they're going to have to take a view on how they are in so-called hedging against currency rates. And of course, particularly the large publishers will have very big teams of clever people that go figure out all of this stuff and try and set their price differentials accordingly and anticipating shifts in exchange rates. So that's another subtlety of inflation is foreign exchange or variations in foreign exchange rates.
Great. Thanks, Dan. So in terms of transformative agreements, is there any intel that we have about their influence on APC pricing overall or impact?
Short answer is very little because the agreements tend to be very specific between a publisher and an institution or a buying consortium. And then within that, of course, there may be discounts negotiated, or there may be partial discounts negotiated. So, for example, a transformative agreement might say, right, we will offer readership and publishership or publishing services for all of these journals for one low price of X dollars. Up until a certain cap, and then once you publish above a certain number of papers, then we might start charging at a marginal rate at a per paper APC. So there's all sorts of complexity there. What I do say on this is looking at individual per paper charges, we think is very relevant to transformative agreements, because when a publisher comes to fix their bundled price, what's my one low price? I'm going to charge a whole institution. They've got to start somewhere, and they need to set that price based on what their anticipated revenue is, partly for the subscription element of the deal, but then of course partly for the publishing element of the deal. And that in turn is going to lead them and most publishers into a calculations about how many papers do we think we're going to publish in that institution, and what kind of price should we charge them to get a fair income. And so in that sense, we think modeling APCs can be very, very useful because it gives you a sense of how publishers set their prices relative to each other. And that is like to factor into their calculations for transformative agreements, read and publish agreements, publish and read agreements, etc., whatever you want to call them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and another thing that I think it's important to take into consideration is when the universities are negotiating with the publishers, for the universities to determine whether they're getting a good deal, what their savings is going to be depending upon the pricing that they're going into that with. And we know that online digital pricing, big deal pricing was often tied to print spend. So while it's easy to say all of these, agreements are very individual, each institution, contextually is starting, with different data points. And so we could, try to find, two that are very similar, and then we look at them and their publication patterns, their subject area patterns, their funding patterns are going to be different. So it's hard to do an analysis that's really going to cover from those different directions. But one place that I do think the transformative agreements have made a difference is the social sciences and humanities. I have to say this at least once every webinar. I'm an historian. And the awareness that has been generated on campus when these agreements come into place with the larger publishers that have, multiple subject areas included, it raises the prospect of open access publishing for departments that just did not see that as a viable option, for them in the past. And so I do think it's definitely making a difference there in terms of open articles across a variety of subject areas that you just wouldn't have seen probably even 5 years ago.
Great. That's a good segue, unplanned, Heather, into my next question, which also dovetails nicely into a question from one of our attendees, which is how different subject areas are behaving. And the attendee question was, how are different publishers behaving? Are there differences there? So I think that kind of ties in a bit with that subject area behavior as well. If you want to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that the publisher behavior may well be another great news and views topic that we can put on the line, and certainly in the tool when we're going to look at things, we always find some interesting patterns that come there. Subject area wise, I can't recall whether you mentioned this in the headlines or not, Dan, but we did see one of the biggest jumps in pricing happen in arts and humanities. And they have had relatively large jumps compared to some of those single digit jumps for other subject areas for like 3 years running. 20% increase compared to last year, 30% increase the year before, 15%. They were starting from lower points, lower price points, so they definitely have more, room to grow, but they're catching up relatively quickly with some of the other subject areas. But if you pull out social sciences, because so many times we just say arts and humanities and social sciences in one breath, the social sciences are going up at a slower rate. So for fully open, the APCs and the social sciences have basically caught up. But I think that there's going to be a number of things that are going on there under the hood. I mean, the funding patterns, arts and humanities, and compared to social science, they're going to have quite different funding patterns. And I think it's probably more likely that folks in social science might have APC coverage in their funding grants, and less likely that historians and English professors and stuff would have funding that looks like that. So would like to look more deeply into that. The other thing, which I think is critical when you start to break these subject areas apart, is that the journal sizes are quite different. You can have a journal in humanities or social sciences that is publishing less than 50 articles a year, even less, maybe in some instances than a dozen, compared to some of the medical journals that are, in the 5,000 article a year. So even though these look like quite dramatic increases, if you look at the article output, that is going to be a factor. The other thing we don't really know with these prices in art and social sciences and humanities is what kind of discount. I mentioned the inclusion in transformative agreements, and so it may well be why those APCs are increasing a lot as a list price. That's not actually what's being paid. And that's I'll just do the social science and humanities because that's, an area that I'm always interested to peek in. But we, Lori, and a lot of client projects will go in, and I did a deep dive. I think one of the deep dives last year was on pricing and, engineering and different types of engineering. And so it gets quite granular and going in and looking and seeing what people are doing. And I said publishers are getting a lot smarter. They have a lot more data. There's a lot more factors in their consideration. And so the subject area behavior going to be interesting for some time to come.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
then could I just come in on the publisher bit? So because I think one of the questions about are some publishers more aggressive than others? Unfortunately, it's not quite that easy because if you think of a very big publisher, they may have hundreds, in some cases, a few thousand journals in their list. So in actual fact, their average price increase is going to mask an awful lot of variation. Back to what Heather was saying, a particular publisher may have chosen to put up their arts and humanities prices by significantly more than, I don't know, their engineering prices. That might simply reflect how they view the marketplace or how things are going on. Of course, those two might cancel each other out when you start to look at the averages. So I think to look at a sort of an average or typical publisher is not necessarily going to get you the kind of analysis you need. that might come into play if you were saying, right, let's only look at cheese making journals or chemistry journals or or history journals. Then at that point, of course, if you had a specialist publisher who's largely occupying that footprint, you could then compare that one publisher with a subset of a large publisher or other publishers' portfolios to get a like-for-like comparison. So it's not quite that straightforward. And I think similarly, I think there was a note about the not-for-profit and how we're using societies as a proxy. Again, it gets a little bit complicated because many societies or not-for-profits will engage the services of a for-profit or commercial publisher to do their publishing. As Heather mentioned, we do track the overlap. So that then begs the question, well, kind of who's sitting where? If you factor the publishers' journals and prices on top of their commercial platform provider, then are they kind of contributing towards the commercial side of things? Even though, of course, the journal itself and maybe some of the editorial work is owned by the not-for-profit society. So it's a little bit hard to tease that apart. We've gone down the route of societies mainly because that is often how the industry organizes itself. And especially, for example, in the wake of Coalition S and Plan S coming out, there was a lot of discussion about how that might affect societies who tend to be mission-driven organizations compared with the sort of more commercial and very large publishers. However, again, there could be a bit of an overlap. Some of the larger societies, of course, do generate a lot of revenue and might be, say, more immune to some of these changes that might affect smaller societies just because of scale. So we split the society versus not as really that seemed the most convenient way of doing it and helped us get just an angle on how the market sees itself. But point well made. Yes, in an ideal world, we go through our many publishers and tens of thousands of journals and try and decide exactly which side of the fence each one fell. But we think that just would end up with a very long tail of sort of lots and lots of effort for relatively little or very much diminishing returns. So that's why we've drawn the line where we do.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Dan. In terms of the fully open journals that don't charge APCs, they've held steady. So Heather, I'll turn this question to you to start. Why hasn't the push to subscribe to open or non-APC journal models impacted this? We do hear about those journals. Maybe they get a little bit more airtime sometimes. But so why hasn't that impacted?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll take the subscribe to open part second. When we're talking about, diamond journals, Dan likes to call them sponsor journals. I don't like that terms quite so much, but you're gonna have to have the money to either launch or turn a journal, into something like that. And so that money is gonna have to come, from somewhere. And it might be that you go down the subscribe to open path, or it might be that it's a more of an overt, sponsorship situation. But when we're doing analysis on these journals, it's a little bit tricky because there's not there are some, trying to get at that data. There's no flag, for example, there's no metadata coding that indicates that something is, one of these journals. And so when we do our analysis, and we've done a couple of pieces in News and Views over the past few years, what we do is we look at journals that have not charged APCs for 3 years, because most introductory offers for new journals, which could get mixed up in that category if you're just looking at who doesn't charge APCs, those introductory offers are usually 1 or 2 years. So if you have a pattern of 3 years or more with no APCs, you could make a reasonable assumption that that is a journal that is not charging APCs. So we're starting with that. That might be an undercount, but it's been interesting to look at that group. But these kinds of changes, whether it's a new journal launch in that area or whether it's a conversion of a journal to that model, take a lot of time. So, it looks to us like they're sitting steady, but it's, the duck that's calm on the surface, but the legs are kicking underneath the water. And I think, particularly when it comes to subscribe to open, those, some of the indicators lag behind. I happen to be joining this call from Electronic Resources and Libraries in Austin, Texas, and I talked to a lot of salespeople this week. And, some of them are going to know immediately about library budgets, but most of them say it's going to be something they don't really know the complete picture on until next year. So for the subscribe to open models that do have renewal pledges from libraries, a lot of that may already have been a done deal by this point, and we'll learn more in the future. But if you look at the number of fully OA journals, the number of journals that are charge hybrid, and compare that to the number of journals that have been committed to subscribe to open, that is a tiny, tiny number. It's a really interesting group, and they talk a lot, and there's a lot of larger publishers that have signed on for some portion of their journals to be subscribed to open. It's a little bit of like a question mark whether we're going to see more journals that move into that category or not. Very few journals have backed off of that. And I think arguably it was kind of their offer and maybe it needing a little bit more time to be thought through before it was out there. And so I think that some of those publishers that have backed off will probably regroup and come out again, because it's a big there's a big belief in subscribe to open, and it's got a great community practice. So we're going to continue to watch those closely, and I'd say lots of fodder for some news and views coming up.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a question here in the Q&A about if we've looked at new launches and flips to OA, or journals that have completely closed down, just shifts in journals as part of our evaluation, and if that has any impact or would have any impact. I dare say there's 20,000 plus journals in the analysis. So unless there was some huge movement in that direction, it might not have a large impact. But Dan, any comments around?
So yeah, we can capture that as a to-do. That could be an interesting thing to dive into. We have the data. I think you're absolutely right, Laurie. I suspect the numbers that move from one to the other, yes, there'll be a churn, but it's likely to be a relatively small volume. Going back to that fully open access popular price bands, all the colored lines. Remember, I talked about the plateau. I think there was one of the sort of drivers behind that plateau was some hybrid journals that were moved from being hybrid to fully open. They'd have come in probably towards the higher end and probably nudged the right-hand side of the plateau up, kept it level. But as I said, we were probably talking about a few dozen top whack out of several thousand. Therefore, it's unlikely to move the needle that much. So it's an analysis. I think we've always found there's probably more pressing things we could dive into, but certainly would be worth looking at. We can capture that, and if there's a there, we can write about it. If there's something interesting to see.
And it's 2025 now, and I know that there are some larger publishers, at least that have hundreds of journals, that have pledged to make that shift at some point this year. So watch this space.
And it could be we're actually seeing this happen by implication, because as I said, the number of hybrid journals had largely stayed the same over last year and the year before. Meanwhile, fully open access journals have increased. Now that could actually be because there might be new hybrids being opened up, existing hybrids moving across. That means that hybrid stays neutral, goes up and goes down, they cancel each other out, and meanwhile we're seeing that increase in fully open. So yeah, absolutely, there could well be some interesting emerging patterns under the hood there.
Absolutely. So we're coming near the top of the hour, and so I'll give an opportunity for both of you or each of you to if there's anything in particular in the Q&A that we haven't addressed that you'd like to address, or any closing comments or additional information you'd like to add before we close out for today.
I'll just answer, there's a couple of extra Q questions that we haven't covered. So why not use an average weighted number of the articles of each journal? No, you didn't miss that in the methodology because I didn't mention it. Yes, that's actually a good idea. We do that for some of our analysis in our tools. So there's a whole piece looking at the statistical correlation between APCs and measures of impact. We have a table coming out, if you're familiar with a Pearson correlation coefficient. So this is a measure of how closely related two things are. We do some analysis, and for some things like that, we will look at both the numbers of journals and also the numbers of articles published in each, and use that as a weighting. So we have that data, but thank you for that. That's a good suggestion. We could add that to our list, A, to maybe add that to some of the tables in the tool, but B, also might give us another piece of analysis we could look into. Again, if there's something worth reporting, then we could do a piece on it and see if there is a kind of notable difference between the weighted average and the average per journal. We also did a piece, I think 2 or 3 years ago, that basically, if you go to our website and I look at the news section, when up means down, I think was part of the title. I'm sorry, I don't have the link to hand, but we did a whole piece analyzing the effect of how what happens if you publish a lot of papers in a journal with a small price increase or vice versa, and how do numbers of papers affect the average price that somebody's likely to pay. So we have done some of that analysis in depth, and we drew up a little table, and I think I found 2 examples of publishers where both had the same headline average price increase of, I don't know what it was, 2 point something%, let's say, but when you factored in the numbers of papers published, one of them, actually that's translated into like a 7% price increase on average, but the other one resulted in a 7% price reduction simply because of the way they spread things between cheaper and more expensive journals, and where the numbers of papers were being published. So yes, we've done some of that analysis. Yes, we should add it, I think, perhaps to our headlines in future. So thanks very much for that feedback. But no, you didn't miss anything in the method. And then finally, yes, there was a point about we're looking at APCs offered. We can't really get at APCs chosen because that tends to be confidential data or behind paywalls, or just generally not easily available. I do have to acknowledge the Open APC project, which tried to look into that, but unfortunately the quality of the data really did vary. So sometimes people were declaring APCs paid that were higher than the list price. Probably not what's really happening. Could well be, for example, they were including taxes in what they were reporting. For some people maybe including sales taxes, other people weren't. So actually getting to that information can be quite hard. So that's why we alight on the prices offered. It's a consistent baseline. It allows us to measure things relative to each other, so between publishers or subjects and over time. But yes, I think in terms of the actual price paid, it's likely to be discounted down from that in reality.
I'll just quickly add 2 things. We do work with many of our library subscribers that have that information on exactly what their researchers have paid, and the piece that they have a challenge with is getting the list price so that they know whether they're saving anything. And so that is something that we do on a kind of a regular basis. And finally, we all know we're moving into some uncharted waters, and so it's going to be interesting to see what happens when we do this exercise, in early 2026. There have been maybe some predictable trends, fallen back to trend. We had a COVID deviation, but it could well be that the responses from publishers around these pricing points change dramatically over the course of the next year. We'll just have to wait and see on that one. But thank you guys for coming today.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Good point, Heather. Well, thank you both for a great session, as always. That's it for us for today. We'll be sharing a recorded version of this session in a few days, and you'll receive notification when it's available in case you want to listen again or share it with any of your colleagues, refer back to it. If anything more occurs to you, please don't hesitate to contact us. We're happy to continue the conversation. Heather and I will be at STM next week too, so if you want to grab either one of us for a conversation, we're happy to do that as well. And then CSE and SSP after that, it's that it's that season of travel. So we hope to see some of you on the road in the next few weeks. And thank you again. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.